So I was just thinking about how with fictional worlds like Alice in Wonderland, there's this common theme. I don't know if as much in the books as in the case of like the film adaptations, or at least the Tim Burton one that I'm thinking of. But you see this. I've seen this definitely a few times, and with this idea, which is that we go on our journey to the other world, to the underworld, to the dream world, in order to learn something that we bring back to the real world, and use that knowledge to make the real world better. Now, the way I imagine a psychologist or whatever would view that, or your average scientist, which they're not incorrect, but I think they're not all the way to the final answer, is they go, oh well, you created you created a fictional environment where your subconscious, basically they would describe it as like you're climbing into your subconscious to make a conscious a primordial truth or an eternal truth of some kind, and then bring it back to the real world, and that's that. But it's just psychological. What I think actually is going on with all fictional, otherworldly, and spiritual messaging of that kind is that what it speaks to is that when you go to the other place, because I'm a supernaturalist, or someone who thinks that non-physical reality is the realist reality, right? So material matter emanates from the spiritual atomic core of the center of the universe, right? So what I think is actually happening is when we have dreams, when we have visions, when we have, not that they're all the same, but generally speaking, when you're given symbolism in a dream state or in a story or whatever it might be, or a story about going into a dream state or another world or whatever, I think that's literally a way for us to heal and come back to this world, but it's also a way to the reason that it is because you're actually going back to source, or closer to source at the very least, to get that knowledge. And you're getting knowledge that makes, or can make, your life, you have to go through that transformation or that reawaken, right? So it's actually a spiritual transformation, not simply a psychological realization or epiphany. It's deeper than that. And I think it speaks to what I believe to be true, and I've always believed to be true, especially with the greats, what they're tapping into with, their imagination is, and their inspiration is like all artists, which I've talked about before. If you're doing your job correctly, you're going into a dream state, a visionary state, a religious type state of some kind, and coming back with eternal archetypal knowledge, wisdom, that you can then apply in your real life, thus transforming yourself and thus transforming the world as you apply that once you're back. And a lot of people like to break down fictional worlds that way, like Wizard of Oz, whatever it might be, and in some cases they are correct, right? But what I loved about Tolkien, to get into Lord of the Rings real quick, is that he didn't like allegory, which I always found very interesting. Now, me personally, I don't really have a problem with allegory, but I think I've begun to understand why he had a problem with allegory, because I don't think it's fair or accurate to say that the best fiction is simply fiction. It's not just a fake story with some thread of truth in it. It's actually realer than our own reality, because the dream state, because reality itself is a fiction, basically, is what I'm saying. And so the dream state is constant transformation, constant journeying, constant evolution. And what am I trying to say here? Basically, when you I forgot where that thought was going, but I do think that it's a real place that we go into, even if it's constructed by ourselves But even dreams themselves aren't constructed entirely by ourselves. We're not entirely in control of it, right? That's the way a psychologist would say it. Is like, well, your subconscious is like, no. In my experience with dream states, sometimes you're, in fact, often contending with rules, physics that you don't care for, that you didn't ask for, that you didn't request. Events will happen, characters will show up that you didn't request. And so, kind of like similar with some of these, DMT studies and experiences that people report, where at a certain point, yes, you could say XYZ is my imagination or is my projection, but then you run into a wall of the other. And the other is not simply the subconscious. Maybe in some cases, yes, it's something repressed or whatever that you're trying to, your subconscious is trying to show you, or something that you just haven't or don't want to face yet. But I think often we're actually being communicated with and acted upon by external forces, which of course is the spiritual supernatural unification with all religions, cultures, mythologies throughout time, in the ancient world anyway, this idea that there are these archonic forces, there are these inherent archetypes. Now, the archonic forces I view as something a little bit different than the archetypes, but there are similarities with that, and they can embody archetypes themselves and are archetypes themselves. But the archons are more, the evil ones, obviously, being which are, pretty much all of them as I understand it, are the demonic forces, essentially, right? And I think that when we go into these dream states, they are the adversaries we face. I had a recurring dream, which is funny to talk about in here, I'm sure. But at the time I was going through it as a kid, it felt very real. And it was very terrifying and felt demonic, as I would describe it even then, with the experience. But I had watched the movie E.T. as a kid and suffered, even though I could watch the movie fine, even though I did find it a little bit scary as a kid. I mean, I was very young, like 6, 7 kind of thing. I kind of was fascinated by it and had to keep watching it, so maybe that was part of it, just a weird whatever. It's like I wanted to conquer the fear. But I had bad dreams for years and years and years until I was like 11 or 12, and it got better and better over time, but it still was. But then when I finally got over it, I remember, actually no, until I was about 9. So it did last a long time, though. But when I finally got over it, what was interesting was the way that I stopped those experiences, those nightmares, where he was attacking me, whatever. It would get pretty gruesome where, like, oh, he's eating me alive, and I could feel the pain, except it would be, like, nightly, or almost nightly kind of a thing. So it was, like, a very intense thing as far as experiences to go through, right? But what conquered that, what stopped those experiences for me, was very interesting, and it's a lesson I've carried with me through life, which is, I had this final nightmare with E.T., and I'm facing it down a hallway, and he comes waddle running at me. So it's a funny scenario already, but it's terrifying if it was actually happening to you. It's like funny, but only if you're not really there watching footage of it, basically. And I turn to my left, and there's like a knight statue, because we're like in a castle corridor of some kind from like the 1500s, where there's like knight statues with armor and weapons and stuff. And something just, I felt like God was telling me, like, hey, grab the spear, So I grabbed the spear from the knight statue that's standing there, the armor assembly, whatever you call it, right? And then I let out this primordial scream, because E.T.'s screaming at me the whole way down. His, like from the movie, the E.T. scream, like wailing or whatever. It was pretty terrifying. Like, once again, it's funny, but it was terrifying. And so I start running at him with my spear, Spartan style, and it feels like it takes forever that we're running at each other like this, screaming, and I'm just like, and I'm terrified, but I'm like, I gotta kill this bastard. And then finally, when we meet, of course, I plunge the spear through his heart, and he's like shocked, like, oh crap, you killed me, And he looks down, he's like, And then I woke up, and there was this huge release from that in the dream or nightmare sequence, and I felt that release when I woke up, and I was like, oh wow, that was it's like, that to me right there is not simply a subconscious archetypal reenactment of some kind, right, for the sake of mental development. I think that's way deeper. I think that if anything, once again, the archetypes exist on their own inherently. Anything alive that's logos, that's consciousness, is tied to these eternal archetypes, right? But whatever the archons are, demonic forces, evil forces, or whatever, and the good forces as well, I think can literally embody, or especially in the dream state for sure, and visionary state for sure, but in the dream state especially, can embody these entities, or these entities, sorry, can embody these archetypes, right? Because when you read Jacques Vallée's book, Passport to Magonia, I remember when I first read it, I was like, oh, this guy's very much similar lines of thinking as the way I look at it, which is that whatever the phenomenon is, it, depending on the culture and the time period that it's trying to target, it will take on the form in which it's most effective. And I've heard this with a lot of, demonic interactions as well. It's going to take on the nightmare form of your fear, which has been something that I've seen embodied in many works of film and television, where you have some kind of demonic or evil, monstrous entity that literally uses what you fear most to, essentially the boggart from Harry Potter, right? If your biggest fear is spiders, if your biggest fear is snakes, right, it embodies that. So I think that it is a way for self-development, but also I think that it's actually, it's fundamentally, or at least once again, maybe not all of those experiences, but some of those experiences I've had for sure felt much more like I was contending with an actual demonic force of some kind, or influence of some kind. And maybe in that sense it is a test as much as anything else for the sake of self-development, right? To realize that dragons can be slain, to realize that the way you defeat the monster of fear is to rob him of that which he feeds, which is fear itself, right? And so it's not the only reason, but it's one of a million reasons why I'm a supernaturalist with my I call it supernatural philosophy, basically, because it makes way more sense for the study of the mind and the self and everything else to look at it in that way. It's not the only reason I believe in those things, right? And I've had real life experiences too, totally separate from dream experiences, that were very much validate this theory as well. That the Bible talks about angels being good or bad. Man can entertain angels unawares, so they can take on human form. Demonic entities can shapeshift and all those things. Fallen angels can shapeshift. So whether they actually shapeshift or they can just affect your mind using glamour or whatever, which pops up in the Book of Enoch and Irish folklore, a lot of weird places using that specific word, glamour, as a way of describing the hypnotic power of the majestic serpent of the Garden of Eden. Reports of reptilians and lizard people in the modern UFO lore, how they have this ability to just physically cause fear, and that they feed off of that, and that they can affect your mind or make you hallucinate or whatever, right? So there's these common themes, and I always look for archetypal patterns in attributes in that way, because it's the only way to study this stuff to make any kind of sense of it. Because they're purposely actors staying in the shadows, and once again, they only come out when, oh, you believe in Norse gods, so we're in the Norse god phase. Oh, you believe in alien greys, well, we're in the alien greys phase. I'm not saying those are all for sure the same entity behind all those things, but that there is certainly a pattern that seemed to emerge with all that. Like I said, just read Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia. It's a brilliant work. I don't agree with everything he says or his entire conclusion, but it's the closest I've ever seen any UFO researcher get to my, as far as of prominence, especially, like my way of looking at this stuff, and not just mine, but many other people who have come before me. I mean, you could point to a million people as far as, inspiration, and fellow travelers, and parallel thinking, and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, when I was younger, I used to think I was one of the only people who was waking up to this stuff. But as I grew older and into my teens and 20s and whatnot, I realized that actually there's a lot of people who have been, the Gary Wayne Genesis 6 stuff, right? The Genesis 6 conspiracy and all this stuff. I'm like, what got them started in this was the same thing that got me started in this with, I was 8 years old and reading, about the fallen angels coming down to, they took the daughters of the daughters of men for their wives, right? And those were the sirens, the witches of old, because the fallen angels taught them black magic and sorcery and necromancy and astrology and pharmakia and all these things, right? So to me, it's fundamental that we live in a spiritual, supernatural universe, which is why it's covered up so much, why it's denied, why they have to tell you, oh, no, actually, it's all evolution, it's all this, it's all that. Of course, I'm not saying that there's not adaptation and fluctuation, obviously, but when it comes to just the scientific paradigm, it's so hell-bent on denying any amount of, because that's just one piece of it, right? But they'll deny all kinds of stuff until the CIA declassifies, oh, actually, remote viewing's real. We did studies on it, and it was actually very effective for psychic warfare and spying. You know what I mean? So you have these recurring things happen over and over again where it's denied in the public, but the reality is that there is something to it, and that, just like all mythology, all legends, all conspiracies that last, they're not just rumors. If they're really last long enough time, it's like these archetypes that are very unique and yet pop up in every culture, right? Vampires, witches, wizards, mermaids, giants. It's because it happened. It's part of the collective memory, and so it's held on to in the form of folklore and whatnot. The reason it's impressed upon our memory in that way and held on for so long is because there's a seed of truth to it. And so I want people to get to that point. More people, I guess, is what I mean, because I know there are people who are already thinking this way, believe this stuff. And it's not about, just believing it. It's about recognizing, like, this is actually where the evidence actually leads to anybody who actually bothers to go down the rabbit hole and do the work, and do the research, and ask the questions. And even more than that, the personal experiences. Like I said, I've had so many personal real-life experiences that have validated these theories. That's where the theories come from. In fact, I'm not even trying to say that my theories are comprehensive or absolute, but they're absolutely rooted in the data. They're absolutely rooted in the experiences of, once again, these otherworldly phenomenon. And I keep meaning to write a book, which I've wanted to for a long time, that I want to call just The Others. And it might be fiction, it might not be, but either way, it's going to be rooted in my view of how this stuff actually works and what they're really like, what these things are. Which, like I said, I think it's the supernatural family, the spiritual family, the angelic family, whatever you want to call it, on both ends of the spectrum, good and evil. I think it's like that old quote. I forget who said it. Who said William Blake or somebody like that? I want to say who said, or maybe it's older than that. Maybe it's like back Greek philosopher times where they say there are more things in heaven and hell than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. And I love that quote because it's so damn true to the reality of our supernatural universe and world. And like I said, I think there's something to all that, and experience after experience has solidified that with me. And I always say go with God. Yeshua is our Savior. Father in heaven is our God. And there is an evil demonic force that rules this world for a short, brief time in comparison to eternity. And his minions absolutely, I think, try to manipulate us through these dream experiences and through waking experiences too. This isn't only just in dreams. There's definitely a crossover with all that stuff as well. And just to throw in UFO stuff in here real quick, I've seen many UFO, like more than I could count. I've had more UFO sightings in my life than I could honestly document or keep track of if I wanted to, which I know is saying something, but it's just facts as far as what I've experienced of all different kinds: orbs, mechanical-looking craft, star-looking things that you think is a star, and then it like definitely isn't a star. Stuff like that. And the most intense UFO experience I had was when I lived in Beverly Hills, and what was crazy was this dream experience I had right upon waking up. And it was one of those dreams where you felt like you weren't dreaming the whole night, and then right before you wake up, you're in a very, very intensely real feeling dream. And what was weird about that was I felt the wind on my face. I could smell the grass in the forest because I was in a forest, you know what I mean? Meanwhile, I'm assuming this strictly was a dream, I'm just in my apartment, sleeping, and I have this kind of classic X-Files type moment where I'm like in the woods at night. I'm like, I hear the crickets and all that kind of stuff and the frogs, and then all of a sudden, like, I'm telling the story in order of how it happened to my, what I'm going through, what I'm thinking, and how experiencing. So I'm standing in the middle of the forest. It's quiet, something eerie, but I feel like there's a presence. Like I can't see or smell or sense anything, but I have this knowing that there's something around somewhere, watching me or whatever. And then there's this light that gets projected down on me, and I look up and I'm like, wait, what the fuck, And then that light was blinding. I felt like I really saw, like once again, every moment of this felt extremely real. And I was sleeping, I was dreaming during this part of the story. That's key to understand, right? And it's a UFO. Like after a few beats, I realized like, oh, I think this is a UFO. And then at this point, I'm asking myself, I'm like, how did I get here? What's going on? Am I about to get beamed up? And I felt like I was about to be beamed up, or I was being returned. I couldn't quite decide, but it felt like I was about to be taken, or I was taken. I'm like, starting to float, and then I wake up, and I'm like, okay, so that was a dream. Totally conscious at this point. No more dreaming, no more whatever. And I'm like, okay, that's so weird. That was interesting. And then I go out to the alleyway behind my apartment. I'm taking out the trash, and then I go for a walk. And right as I'm about, like literally just a couple steps, I stop, and it's that same feeling, except it's during the day, but it's that same feeling, like, hey, there's a presence, something's here. I can feel my spidey thing. There's like a signal. I can pick up on some kind of frequency, whatever you want to call it. And I look up just a little bit, like from here to what, and it's right where I subconsciously somehow knew it was going to be. And that's when I saw this UFO, and I recorded it, I posted it. Of course, almost nobody gave a shit, because at this point, right? And there are a lot of fake UFO videos, so I don't blame people for not believing in them for that reason, for sure. But there's also plenty of legitimate ones. Finding them is difficult, increasingly so. More and more difficult to find the genuine ones, and how do you validate it? And you got to run it through. Oh, is this AI? Is this edited? All that stuff, right? But this was, I was seeing it. I recorded it. It was captured on my phone, so you can't say, oh, well, you're just dreaming still because you were groggy. This was what it told me. What that experience told me was that there is a, in a way where nothing is said, but you put it together, that there's an inherent connection between belief, between, it's like the eyes to see and the ears to hear kind of a thing, or believing is seeing kind of a concept, that until you believe or are willing to believe, then that's when the phenomenon manifests itself and presents itself. And there's a guy on the news too. I found a news footage thing from like the 2000s, 2007-ish is what it feels like when I saw the quality of the video and all that in the era. But this guy, summons UFO for a news team, and they were shocked because they thought this guy's crazy. This will just be a fun story, fun news piece, and it ended up showing up, within 5 or 10 minutes or whatever, and the guy was astounded. And I think it goes back to that principle, if that's a fact, if that can be stated as factual, that the UFO phenomenon is tied to consciousness, which others, as I looked into it from that point on, had said the same thing, then that really does, once again, validate this theory that, the fundamental origin of the most supernatural category of UFOs, because like I said, I think there are mechanical and reverse engineered craft, that's separate, but whatever those things are very, very old and ancient, and I think come from a place, a spirit, or they're either come, depending on how you look at it, they're either from a spiritual or supernatural origin place, or interdimensional, as physicists would say, or at the very least, it's built and constructed with knowledge, which is from such a place, right? And that goes back to, once again, entities that are not human, that are older than humans and wiser than humans because of their, they've seen heaven, they've seen the eternal mysteries, or some of them anyway, right? And with that knowledge, they're able to do things that to us do seem like magic, and fundamentally are magical and miraculous and whatnot. And I don't want to say that every instance is demonic or whatever, because I've had negative and positive experiences, but ultimately I've been very kind of like, I reached a point with it where I was like, okay, well, I don't want to play with this phenomenon, because if you do, you don't know where it might lead, and you don't know, who's on the other end of the phone, right? Or, even if it is whatever, right? It's like, it's still a stranger. You don't know, like, what's their deal? What's their intention? So the people that, like, worship UFOs, or worship get involved in the alien cults type stuff, it's really like from a practical approach, it's just like you still don't know what their intentions are and all that stuff. So that's why I lean towards, like, it's a phenomenon that wants to dupe you. Certainly, at least some of them, half of them do, right? The evil ones, whatever the bad ones are, and they wear these different faces for whatever reason, So, like I said, I think there are, good, angelic, godly, divine phenomenon that happen, and God can put signs and wonders into the world, absolutely. But he also warns us that, the devil, the principality of the air, and all that kind of stuff, which is a very key telling archetypal reference for the devil. That's one of his epithets, is the prince of the power of the air. Will use false signs and false wonders to confuse and mislead the masses as well, right? So all those things have to be considered with these experiences, which is why I wouldn't necessarily, it's like studying the occult. It's like, it's like that Christopher Lee quote where he goes, if you study the occult long enough, you'll lose your mind and go mad and all that kind of stuff. And I do think that's true. And it's not because you won't come across some truths, but there are some truths that man was not meant to know, and that I don't think most men spiritually and mentally can handle, or people, can handle. And so all those are factors that have to be considered. But like I said, with all these experiences, and I also, another experience I had, which was in college, which was also very indicative of, yes, this is a spiritual phenomenon, was when I fell asleep reading the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which I was reading truly from like an academic perspective of like, oh, what do the Egyptians believe? And I'm looking at their hieroglyphs and stuff like that. And I fell asleep reading it, which, don't do that. Don't fall asleep reading the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I'm not saying you can't read the book. I'm saying go with God when you read and study the book, if you do, and don't fall asleep reading it, because that is the only time, never before in my life and never since, have I had a sleep paralysis experience. But I had one that night, or that morning. And I wake up, I can't move my body at all, feel like I'm frozen, fully lucid, fully conscious, and these three entities are running around my room, was the way I can sense it and hear it, knocking over books, because I had a bunch of books stacked and papers and all this kind of stuff I was writing a lot at the time, so I had crap everywhere in my room. And it was obviously going through my shit. I felt like it was reading my books and going through my papers and all this kind of stuff, like figuring out who I was. It was as if I had accidentally opened up a door, and all of a sudden there's a couple like elvish, gnomish, gray alien, whatever they were, never saw them, but I could feel and sense them. And they're all talking to themselves like, like not like dorky alien speak, but like some kind of weird other human-esque but not human language is the best way I could say it. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is whatever, once again, call it elvish, call it gnomish, call it whatever. Like, I'm guessing, even as it's happening. I'm like, I don't know what, But they're obviously talking to each other, and there's this, like, it was weird because I couldn't understand the words, but I could understand the meaning of what they were saying, if that makes sense, like the gist of it. So that was strange, too, where they're speaking in words that I shouldn't be able to understand, and yet I felt like I understood basically that they were, like, trying to figure out, who the hell is this guy? And why are we here? Not why are we here, but like, how do you open this door? And what the fuck, what's his deal? So I found that interesting. But then the most profound part of that experience was when I called upon, literally the moment I got even halfway through Jesus Christ, save me, help me. And by the time I finished with Jesus, literally they got sucked out of the room as if like a vortex had opened or the vortex or portal by which they enter the room, they got sucked out through the window, and like truly like that. And then and as soon as that happened, and then I could sense it closing, and they were gone. That's when my inability to move any muscle in my body, like literally all I could do was move my eyes underneath my eyelids. Couldn't open but I'm hearing everything perfectly fine, perfectly consciousness-wise, totally lucid. And then that experience happened. So, and I had an experience at Santa Monica Pier where I ran into a demonic entity of some kind, is how I would describe it. I'm sure other people, if they had the experience, would describe it in different ways, but archetypically, fundamentally, that would be the category under which to put it into. And same thing, called upon Christ, and that stopped it. So I can't speak enough the power of Christ and how that affects and can save you from those kinds of experiences. God forbid you should ever have them, as far as the demonic or dark experiences. But the other experiences that I've had, and even some of the evil ones, I think I was allowed to have in order to... It always felt like God was leading me on this trail of information and wisdom and those experiences even to allow me to fully comprehend and understand a very difficult truth for someone who's grown up in my generation, which is that these things are real, that the supernatural is real, and that even though they're not in all cases incarnated or physical bodies, there are logos, consciousness, spirits, entities, similar but vastly different from humans, that act upon us without our awareness, and most of the time are outside of our material scientific way of studying them. And I think that's an important thing for science to ask itself, which I think it's beginning to now, which is, if you really want to be a good scientist, you have to ask yourself the question of how can we scientifically investigate phenomenon that may or may not exist outside of our scientific physical principles of what's real. In other words, are we not inherently handicapped in studying these phenomena for the exact reason that, it's like that Tesla quote of Nikola Tesla, the inventor, famous guy, if you don't know him, Tesla Tower, a million things, right? Elon stole his brand, but Tesla has this quote about how, when the day science, I'm going to fuck it up, but it's something like the day science realizes that, like studies the supernatural and non-physical, I think is what he calls it, phenomenon, it will learn more in a year than in 1,000 years of what it's studied so far, which I think is absolutely true. Because, once again, going back to that fundamental principle, we are supernatural entities. Nature, the world, heaven and earth is a supernatural vessel, and that there are other entities. The others are a very real phenomenon. So, anyway, just wanted to share that with you guys. Kind of my thoughts on this stuff. I think it's very much real. I've experienced it myself. I've studied a lot of stuff too from other people's experiences. And to me, the Bible and the Book of Enoch and other, what I believe to be biblical holy texts, are in conjunction. Like, if you use that as your root and then you study all these other things, these mythologies, cultures, realize that Nimrod is Osiris, Semiramis is Isis, Isis is Hera, Hera is Freya, it goes on and on and on. Osiris is Zeus, Osiris is Odin. You realize that all these things are a lot less complicated than they appear to be, and that they're a formula, and that just that this stuff's real. It's not necessarily easy to accept, but it is simple once you see it for what it is. And it's funny because it's like, once again, the things you believe in as a child are often way more true than the things you come to believe as an adult, because by the time you're an adult, you've been indoctrinated, brainwashed into the educational system, mass media culture. You have all these intelligence agencies trying to convince you that, NASA never lies to you and all this shit, and that, yeah, we went to the moon, whatever it might be. And so you just realize one day, like, oh yeah, like the world is the lie, not my spiritual intuition. And so that's why I say, listen to your gut, listen to your spiritual intuition, listen to God, pray to not be deceived, right? because they will use those dream states, those visionary states, and your very real waking life to act upon you in ways that you can't see. And I think, it's kind of like in the Constantine, not that I totally love everything about what that movie was trying to say about the nature of reality, but it's a little bit like the Constantine thing of like, God and the devil, I don't think they literally made this pact, but that's the narrative in that, right, as a way to kind of explain this idea that, in the Constantine universe, they say that, God and the devil basically made an agreement to not directly interfere, but that they can, each other's minions can subtly influence for good and evil, the guardian angels versus the demons kind of a thing, and act on human life in that way, but in a way where it's, once again, not letting on who their real forms and who they really are, and they can only suggest and whisper and provide temptation, right, kind of a concept. And I think there is some truth to that concept with how it works for the average person's experience on earth, until they find God and accept Christ and all that kind of stuff, is that they will be acted upon by these things completely unknowingly. And the closer you get to God, the more the devil tries to fight you, because the more you're awakened by God and the Holy Spirit and blessed with discernment, the more you begin to have your spiritual eyes opened and awakened truly, not the fake false awakening, which is the mystery school, demonic, Lucifer type shit, right? But when you're with God the Father and He's blessing you with discernment and opening your spiritual eyes, and there's even a part in the Bible where something about shedding something from your eyes, basically to awaken your mind and so you can see the truth. Then it's a totally different world, because then you're not living in the Matrix. Like, that is what climbing out of the Matrix is, by the way. Spoiler alert. It's not climbing out of this false reality in the sense of like you're going to wake up and you're like unplugged. But but that is archetypically, what happens to you when you have true gnosis, not the false gnosis, but true knowledge, true awakening, true spiritual discernment from God. It is like waking up, except it's more like the Truman Show, where the world doesn't necessarily change, but you awaken to the truth of the world in which you've always lived in. And Truman Show, great movie, right? Definitely had some flat Earth references or whatever, or false Matrix reality references in that. So that's what waking up from the Matrix really is realizing that, if this is a dream world, right, and you go there and, oh, it's a fake fictional world, right, and you don't know how you got there, like an episode of The Twilight Zone. And at first, it's this nice, quaint 50s town, and everybody's nice. And then the longer you're there, you realize something's a little bit off. People don't seem totally conscious, they seem to avoid certain subjects. Sound familiar, There's some political correctness in the air, there's some whatever in the air of like, oh, that's interesting. They won't talk about the old church building. Hey, why do people go to the old church building on Sundays? Everybody gets quiet and they go, would you like another piece of cobbler pie? That's when they go into their shining employee, mode or whatever. That's kind of what it's like, and then one day you go into the old haunted church and you realize it's not a church at all. It's like a demonic altar, and you're like, oh, I got to get the hell out of here. You know what I mean? So that's a little bit more like what it's like. But fundamentally, the archetypal waking up from the Matrix, that is what it is. Except once again, it's like the Truman Show. You're in the Truman Show, then you wake up and you realize like, oh, I was right all along. My gut instincts were right all along. This is a false reality. And I don't like it. Once again, I don't think it's because we live in a game engine, or a computer engine. Because all the nerds out there, that's what they want. Oh, it's simulation theory, But there is some truth with what they're getting at, and what they're bumping into and getting at is that the false Matrix reality is the Babylonian black magic satanic web that's been draped over the earth, that has ensnared, enticed, tempted, and entrapped and enslaved and brainwashed and is killing humanity, right? So when you wake up from that, then the whole system, like white blood cells, Miss Agent Smith goes, what? It's like in They Live, we have one that can see, right? So all of those movies, all these stories, they are absolutely talking about something that's very, very real. And that's why I love fiction, because the greatest of fiction is talking about those kinds of things. In fact, because of the nature of the topic, it's probably the only place that we can speak to each other in mass culturally about the questions and experiences surrounding those phenomena, right? And so I think it's very true, all of this. Let me know your thoughts, how you see the world. I'm always interested in other perspectives because I'm always growing as well. I always encourage people to do their own research, think for themselves, go with God. God's going to be your North Star. Father in heaven's going to be your North Star. Walk with Christ. Don't be deceived because there's so many deceptions that are being hurled upon us constantly. So like I said, let me know your thoughts. Maybe I'm just some crazy weird guy. That's also very possible. Or maybe it's both. Maybe I'm crazy, and I might be crazy, but I'm not wrong. Follow me at JK's Comedy. I do comedy. I also talk about the supernatural, paranormal. We got some awesome projects coming forward. We got some, written a few scripts, some projects, movies, TV shows I'm trying to get made and produced and funded and all that kind of stuff. So stay with me. Cool things are coming. But in the meantime, you can always catch us on our podcast. That's Weird Man, that I host with Khalil Tomlin, my co-host, or we're each other's co-host, I guess. And we have a lot of fun on that show as well, diving into the weird, wacky, wonderful world around us. And it's a comedy and curiosity channel, so we oscillate between, trying to entertain you, trying to make you laugh, and trying to make you think and ask questions and promote a curious mind, because we need more curious minds now more than ever. So God bless, and I'll see you on the other side.